assassination, and Americans largely don't accept the conclusions from the Warren Commission. But Lyndon Johnson, taking over as president, he's going to pick up on a lot of the issues that President Kennedy would have wanted to continue with. And so Lyndon Johnson here, he's a different guy. He's not polished like Kennedy. He doesn't have the look of Kennedy. He's different. But he plans on running a presidential administration similar to that. And you can see in 1964, when the presidential election is coming up, Kennedy, one of his campaign slogans here is "Let us continue." And you see that he's got the silhouette of Kennedy in the background, and he makes it pretty clear that he wants to see Kennedy's policies enacted over time. And to do that, Lyndon Johnson's going to propose what he called the Great Society. He said that the United States is the wealthiest nation on the planet, and as such, they should have the resources to take care of people in need. And Lyndon Johnson believed that we needed to help people. And so one of the things that his Great Society vision included was a society where we do our best to eliminate poverty. And Lyndon Johnson makes a bold move by declaring war on poverty. He says that the government has an obligation to help people in need and lift them up out of poverty. And one of the areas where Lyndon Johnson had seen a great need, and many people had wanted to transform this in the past, he said a lot of our senior citizens are vulnerable, particularly when it comes to their health care. And so Lyndon Johnson will not only endorse, but help get created what we now know as Medicare. Medicare is government-run health insurance for senior citizens, that you pay money from every one of your paychecks into a system that when you turn 65, you'll be eligible to get health insurance benefits from the federal government. Senior citizens are the ones who are typically most at risk for real health problems. And so he said, listen, you shouldn't spend your remaining years, your last years on earth, worrying about whether or not you can get appropriate medical care. And that's a big part of what he wants to achieve. All right, but that's not the only thing he wants to achieve when it comes to eliminating poverty. You see right here, Lyndon Johnson will create many of what we call modern welfare programs. And the most important of these is perhaps Medicaid. Whereas Medicare is government-run health insurance for senior citizens, Medicaid is government health insurance for people who fall below the poverty line. You see these other programs exist for individuals who are in poverty. SNAP, the food assistance program, the concept being that in this country, nobody should have to go hungry. There's plenty of food, plenty of wealth, and we can take care of people. There are housing assistance, TANF, which is money that can be used for a lot of different things. The WIC program, there's certain tax credits that you can receive if you don't make a certain income. Pell Grants, of course, which are transformative in trying to help young people break a cycle of poverty so that they can get educated and create a skill set that allows them to make a good living. Various job programs, too. Lyndon Johnson says the federal government will be responsible for these things. There are plenty of critiques about these programs that go along with the merits, but there's no denying that Lyndon Johnson and the fact that he wants government to take over some of these responsibilities, it is going to help people be lifted out of poverty. You take a look at the poverty rate in 1959 and in the early 60s, it's about 23 or 24%. And by the time Lyndon Johnson leaves office in 1969, it's dropped about 10 percentage points. And while there's more to it than just that, I think you'd be remiss to say that Lyndon Johnson's programs didn't have some impact on lifting people out of poverty. That, I think, is undeniable. But one of the problems we do see, if you look at the poverty rate over time, and this graph goes up until 2009, is that the poverty rate has stayed relatively stable since those programs have been initiated in the 1960s. And so, we want to try to get the poverty rate down to nothing. I mean, that's the overall goal. But Lyndon Johnson is going to implement these programs with the hopes of changing America and saying, listen, we need to make sure that we protect the people who are the most vulnerable. And in this case, it was senior citizens or people who are low income. Now, part of the Great Society is also going to include some transformation in terms of women's rights, and Lyndon Johnson also wants to tackle civil rights. And when we get to the counterculture movement and the the desire to see change from Black Americans. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Lyndon Johnson's presidency, his time in office, is going to be marred by the Vietnam War. And remember, just to give you a recap, Vietnam had been separated into North and South. And after we refused to allow elections in 1956, South Vietnam tried to take back, North Vietnam tried to take back the South by force. And the Vietnam War is going to dominate a lot of that, but we're not ready to get to that quite yet. Okay? Part of Lyndon Johnson's time in office, though, is also going to be wrestling with what we call the counterculture. Okay? Counterculture means going against the grain of what the established culture is. And the established culture is really simple. It's what quote unquote normal people are supposed to look like. You see right here, the wool flannel jackets are what men are supposed to dress like. Their hair should be parted in a certain way, not too long. These are what regular men are supposed to do. Men go out, they get married at a young age, they have a family, they work a job. That's what they're supposed to do. You see women right here dressed modestly but still fashionable. They have their hair in a certain fashion. You can't go too short. That's what regular people do. But there are some people who do not want to play by the rules. They don't want to go by society's normal standards. They want to be different. All right? And part of this difference comes, part of the counterculture comes through what we call the sexual revolution. I remember in the 1950s, a lot of younger people started questioning the morals and the leadership of society. And one of the things they question is, why shouldn't we be having sex with anybody we want as long as it's consensual? People start having sex out of wedlock more frequently, and they start having children more frequently too out of wedlock. They push the boundaries of what's considered acceptable. You see people here in a crowd kissing in public like it's no big deal. This is really unheard of even now. People look at you and they think that's strange. But in the 1960s, these people are ultimately going against what society tells them is normal. You're also going to see in the 60s the advent of what we call the gay rights movement. In 1969, it's not going to be till the later part of the 1960s, but in 1969, you have an incident in New York City at a common ordinary bar called the Stonewall. And at the Stonewall, this is where many gay people would go to feel like they were in a safe environment. It's a well-known gay bar. There are a lot of other individuals, the types of individuals that go there as well. Anybody who we would classify in the LGBT community today were people who frequented the Stonewall. But the strange thing is that this bar, because it was home to people who were essentially different, police routinely went to the Stonewall to harass and bother people. That was part of what the era was. Remember, homosexuality is really looked down upon. And at the Stonewall, it was not uncommon for police to show up and they'd bug people and they let the patrons go back to what they're doing eventually. But in the summer of 1969, people decided at the Stonewall they'd had enough. For various reasons, the police were a little more provocative than usual, and they set off, incidentally, a riot that lasts for several nights. And at the riot, you see the police beating people, but these people decided to fight back. The Stonewall riots get a lot of coverage in the media, and originally a lot of newspapers and news outlets wanted to kind of castigate these people as the real problems of society. And you can see right here, it's a derogatory headline meant to paint them in a bad light. But the reality is this: a lot of gay people feel empowered by this because the New York City police are embarrassed for a bunch of primarily gay men who were seen as effeminate or weak to stand up to the New York City police and fight back. Was something that changed a lot of people's attitudes about homosexuals going forward. And in the 1970s, you'll see more rallies and protests of people who were gay demanding equality. And even in the 60s, you still see some activism where people are questioning sexuality. And at the time, it was largely thought that people chose their own sexuality. And gay people at the time were saying that's not the case. We're being treated differently, and we're not going to tolerate this anymore.